How's it, guys? Today I'm going to be discussing classes. I'm going to just do a basic overview of what a class is when we use them. I'm not going to go into too much detail on object-oriented programming, otherwise known as OOP. I will discuss what that is, but I'm not going to actually go into detail of inheritance and all of those things, the benefits that you get from that. So this is basically just a very basic overview of classes, when we use them, and what constructors are, and all of that stuff, all of the detail within a class. So let's start off with describing what a class is. There are many definitions online, and I would encourage you to read them and try to describe in your own words what a class is. But let's imagine a class as being a collection of variables and functions, okay? And you can create an instance of this class, which means it's kind of like when you go, if you go int x, y, and z. X, y, and z are all instances of an integer, basically. So if we had a class, for example, CLS, and we made x, y, z, that would be instances of this class, okay? Now, what makes a class special is the fact that x, y, and z can all be different, okay? They can be unique, and that's when a class is applicable. So if we have a class where we create this class, and whenever we make an instance of the class, it's got constant integers a, b, and c, and it's got one function that you can call, called func, and that returns the sum of a, b, and c. This isn't a useful class, right? Because every instance you create of this, it will be the same. It won't be unique because a, b, and c are constants and they don't change. But as soon as we allow for this class to change a, b, and c, for example, we construct the class with a, b, and c as variables that we don't specify in the class, we specify it outside. Now suddenly, when we call func, if we make 4 different instances of this class, and for every single one we give different values for a, b, and c, func will now return different values for when you call this function for each one of those instances. And that's where a class becomes applicable. Now that's just a very basic explanation of what is required for a class. But yes, it needs to be unique. If it's not unique, it doesn't need to be a class. In most cases, if the class is not going to be unique, as in nothing will change between if you make a single instance of this class or a million instances of the class. If the variables are all the same and the functions will always be the same and nothing changes between them, then most likely it could just be a bunch of functions that you could call. You don't need to make it a class. Okay, so now that we have an idea of what a good class is, let's create one. Let's create a world clock class. Okay, now what this is going to do is it's going to be that you can store the time of a specific city, and then it just, from the time that you created, it'll just track how many seconds have passed, and that will be the time for that city. So I'm just going to create the 2 files, the header file and the CPP file. Let's define this as a world clock. Alright, cool. So that's my header file and my CPP file. I'm just going to include my header file. Alright, and I've already got some pretty magical functions that can do string handling and all of that can get us the time from an entry that we put in. But I'll get to that in a sec. So first, what we need to do is create the class outline. And this is what it's going to be. We're going to create a world clock. It's got a constructor and a deconstructor. This gets called when we create the class, and this one gets called when we remove the class, or when it gets destroyed. Now we can create as many constructors as we want, which means that we can have that the world clock just receives a city name and a time, or maybe just a time if we don't know what the city name is. All of these things, we can specify what constructors we need for this class. And on top of that, we'll have the private variables, right? So let's have something like, we'll have int hour, int minute, and int second. We'll also need something, I'll get to this now, but the start time. So we're going to specify what the time is now, hours, minutes, and seconds. Okay. Then what we need to do is also, from that point, when we've specified the hours, minutes, and seconds, we need to start tracking how many seconds have passed so that we can keep increasing these and changing the time. Okay. So that's kind of the information we'll need, and we'll also need, let's say, a city name. Okay. So we'll create a string there. And so we'll need to include string so that this will work, and I'm going to just use the whole namespace, standard namespace. It's safer to just say using string, but let's rather just use the whole thing. Okay, so this is now my class. It's a world clock class, and if I want to create an instance of it, each instance is going to store an hour, a minute, a second, a start time, and a city name. So what kind of constructors do you think we should have? First one is a default constructor. Okay, that's when you don't send anything. Now in that case, if we had a default constructor, we'd probably just set all of these to 0. We would set the start time to whatever it is, and the city name would be unknown. And then we could run through. Other things that we might want. We might want to just specify the hours. I'm going to just call, okay, in most cases, the easiest way to do this, the way I like to do is put an underscore in front of this, in front of each of your private variables. This is not, you don't have to do this, it's just a convention I follow. And now we send in int hour, int minute, and int second. Okay, so that's another one. If we wanted to create a clock where we don't actually know the city name, but we do know the time, that's another one. Thirdly, what if we wanted to do string city name? And on top of that, we also wanted to do int hour, int minute, and int second, right? That's another one. We can also call one if I wanted to say I'm going to send in the city name, and I'm going to send in a string for the time, okay? So this is where, time string. This is where we'd have something like a string that goes like 12, 06, 05, 10, right? So that's 5 minutes past 12, 5 minutes and 10 seconds past 12. If we want to send in a string like that, we might want to do that too. And then in both of these cases, I'm going to send these as constant strings. We don't need to change them. And I'm going to send them by reference for efficiency. Okay, cool. So these are now going to be the different constructors that we can have. We now have 4 constructors that we should be able to call in the class. So let's copy these over to our CPP file and start filling in what each of these constructors should do. First thing is we need to specify that each of these functions or constructors specifically that we're calling are part of the world clock class. So how we do that is we put the world clock and then double colon, and now that means that this constructor here exists within the world clock class. Okay. The other thing, I'm just going to remove these semicolons and put some squiggly brackets. Let's do that. Cool. And then finally, let's just put some space. Okay. So what happens if we don't send anything, right? Then we would want here our variables are. Let's just take all of these variables quickly. In the class, that would mean that if we don't send anything to the class, we want to create an instance, but we don't send any information at all. Sometimes you can actually just remove the default constructor and say, no, I'm not going to create the class. If you don't send me any information, it's not worth making this class. In our case, we can be a little forgiving with that, and we can just say, we'll set everything to 0. The start time, now this is where the magic time handler comes into play. I'll show you what the header file looks like. I can basically just say get time. And if I use that, it will return the number of seconds that have passed since whenever. It's not such a big deal. I'll show you now. So we will just say get time, okay, and the city name, let's say unknown. Okay, cool. So that's what happens if someone calls the default constructor. Okay, what happens if someone calls the constructor where they just send in the hour, the minutes, and the seconds, right? Now, in that case, we already know, well, we don't know what the city name is, so we can leave that as unknown. Get time, that's always going to be the same. But now, instead of our hour being set to 0, we set hour to our class variable hour to the hour that they send in, the minutes to the minutes that they send in, and the seconds to the seconds that they send in. So now, we can construct this class, and we could send in that it's hour 3, minute 1, and second 1, and it will set the class variables to those. Okay, another one. What happens if we send in the city name? So we send in our city name. Sorry, I just want to change this. Should also just be a constant string city name. Okay. So what happens if we send in a city name? Then it's no longer unknown, right? So now we're sending in the hours, the minutes, the seconds. We're also sending in a city name, so we can change this to being city name. Cool. And the final one is what happens if we send in the city name and a time string. Okay, now this is an interesting one. If we take a look at the time handler, I've got this function called split time string. What it does is it takes in a string that would be like 12 colon 0, 0 colon 0, 1, and it will split that up into 12, 0, 0, 0, 1. So it will populate these integers with whatever the string had. So in that case, the city name remains the same, but our hour, minutes, and seconds are no longer the same, right? So what we need to then do is call this function split time string, okay? And we're going to send in the time string, and we're going to populate the hour, the minute, and the second variables, okay? So that means that it's going to take the string, split it up into the hour, minute, and second, and store it in these variables. And then we're also going to have, we still set the start time to whatever time we are at now, and we set the city name to whatever the city name is. Okay, cool. So that's now our, these are our constructors. Can you think of any other ones that might be useful? I can already think of one. What if I don't know what the city name is, but I do have a time string? Would I not want to maybe still create the clock? Let's do that one. So in that case, we would have a constructor where we would send in only the time string. Okay, and if we call this one, how would that one look? Okay, so the first thing is, don't forget your class name, double colon, to specify that that's where this function exists. Okay, and now we're sending in a time string. So technically, it's similar to this constructor. Okay, we're going to populate the hour, the minute, and the second times, except city name is now unknown again, because we don't know what the name of the city is. Okay, so that's that. Now, what's interesting about these constructors is that they allow for overloading. So if you put in 3 integers, it will know to go to this constructor. If you put in a string in 3 integers, it will know to go to this one. If you put in 2 strings, it will know to go to this one. And if you put in 1 string, it will know to go to this one. But that means that we can't do something like this. We can't do world clock const string ampersand city name, right? Because now both of these constructors have a single string that you send to them. So which one would it call? It doesn't know. So you can't do this sort of thing where you have the same variables being sent to constructors. Your program does not know that at one time when you create an instance, you're sending in a time string, and at the other time you're sending in a city name. So this won't work. Okay. So here we go. We've got all of these constructors for the world clock. And now we need to write a function called, let's say, print time. Okay, and that's going to print out the time, the current time in this class. So let's take a look at that. Let's take this void across, and once again, I'm actually going to make this a small p. So I'd rather have it like that. So void print time, and I'm sure you've noticed that I've got an error already. As before I even start, I need to specify that this is the print time function within the world clock class. Okay, so now we've got this print time, and we need to know what the time is since we set the time, and now a number of seconds have passed. So let's have int num seconds passed equals, and we're going to say it's going to be get time, the time now, minus the start time, right? And sorry, this should be double. Or we can leave it at integer and static cast it to an integer. So because at the moment it's a double, right? Get time, that function returns a double, but we don't really care about milliseconds and stuff like that. So I just want to look at the number of seconds that have passed. Okay. So the number of seconds that have passed are the current time minus the start time. Okay. Now, how do we calculate then how many minutes have passed and how many hours have passed? Okay, so the first thing is how many seconds are in an hour? 60 seconds in a minute, 3,600 seconds in an hour. 60 by 60, right? So that means that we first need to check how many hours have passed. And the way we can do that is get the floor of a number. So if we were to say, what is the floor, so let's say hours passed, is going to be equal to the floor of our number of seconds passed divided by 3,600. Okay, so that means that it's going to take the number of seconds passed. Let's say it was 8,000 divided by 3,600, and then if it was 8,000 by 3,600 is 2 point something, it will just return 2. So we know that 2 hours have passed. Okay, so we know how many hours have passed. Now we say num seconds passed minus equals hours passed times 3,600, right? Because that means I'm now going to minus all of those seconds away because I know how many hours have passed. Next thing, minutes passed. how many minutes have passed? Well, we're going to floor the new number of seconds passed by 60. Because however many minutes have passed, we divide them by 60 to see how many minutes there are. And then we do the same thing. So num seconds minus equals our minutes passed times 60, right? And then finally, number of seconds passed is literally just now the number of seconds passed. Okay, so that's the first thing. We know how many hours have passed, we know how many minutes have passed, and we know how many seconds have passed. The problem is that we originally were working off the fact that we've already got a time, right? So we've got a number of seconds, minutes, and hours. So the first thing is we've got to add underscore sec plus equals the number of seconds passed, right? But there's going to be a problem here. What if we were at 30 seconds and now the number of seconds that have passed are 45? So what we need to now do is see if underscore sec is greater than or equal to 60, then our seconds become 0 and underscore minutes plus equals 1, right? And it should never be a case that you would have the number of seconds passed plus the number of seconds that you currently have being more than 120, right? It can't be more than a minute. So we would only ever add 1 minute. And I'll leave you to figure that one out and see why. Because we're always modding. But okay, so that's the first thing, is we check how many seconds have passed, and our minutes increase by 1 if more than 60 seconds have passed. Okay, but actually, sorry, this shouldn't be seconds equals 0. It's got to be seconds minus equal 60. Okay, cool. So that's the first thing. The next one, if, okay, so now we're going to do underscore min plus equals mins passed. Okay, so if underscore min is greater than or equal to 60. Now in this case, we might be able to, let's just see, we've got the number of minutes passed, let's say 59, but we also take this one, which is 60. So we might have to run this multiple times, okay? So while min is greater than or equal to 60, what do? The first thing is minutes minus equals 60, so we minus 60 minutes, and then hour plus equals 60. Plus equals 1, sorry. So that means we increase hour by 1. Okay, cool. So now we're running through minutes, and while it's greater than 60, we keep minusing 60, and we increase hour by 1. And then finally, for hours, we're going to go hour plus equals hours passed. All right. And now we're going to say while underscore hour is greater than or equal to 24, we just go hour underscore hour minus equals 24. So that means that every single time a day passes, we then go back to the 0th hour, and that's how we get the output there. And now, if we see out that, what we should have is the hour, then let's put a colon, and then we'll do the minute, and then we'll put another colon, and we'll do the seconds. And that's it. Okay, so now we've got a print time function which allows us to print out the time. What else would we want to do? Well, we'd probably also want to print out the city name, right? So we'd have the city name, and then we'd have the time for that city. So let's do something like that. So we've got the city name, and then underneath it, it prints out the time. Okay, so we should be done now. This is a small class. It can be unique, and why can it be unique? Because we can specify what the starting times are, and then we can also specify the city name, which means that there are cases where these variables will be different. I can create multiple instances of the world clock class, and each time I create one, I can change all of these variables, and they can all be different, which means each instance will be unique. So let's include the world clock.h class, right? And let's start off with something like this. So we're going to go world clock, my city, and I'm going to send in let's see what constructors I have here. I'm going to send in a city name and a test string. So I'm going to send in Johannesburg, and I'm going to send in a test string, which was it's 1738, and let's just say it's 45 seconds, right? So that's going to be my constructor. Now if I print out that, So I say print time. See, this is the function print time that exists within the world clock class. I should be able to, it should print out this information. Okay, now, I haven't checked for errors yet, so this may not work the first time. Let's see how it goes. So we're going to G++. I'm going to do C++11, C++14 standard. We're going to do main.cpp, TimeHandler.cpp, and worldclock.cpp. Let's quickly make that. There we go. And my output is going to be main.exe. Oh, okay. Problem floor was not declared in the scope. So let's go back to the world clock and let's just hash include cmath. Alright, cool. And let's try again. Oh, and also end line, same thing, same problem. It doesn't have IO stream yet, so we need to add that. Okay, and now let's give it a go. Cool. Okay, so we've built the main.exe, so let's run it. And there we go. So you can see that it prints out Johannesburg and the time, right? So the next thing that I want to do is add a system clear. Now, system uses the system that you're running on, and then you can put in a command like clear or list or whatever you want. But in this case, what this does is it clears the terminal when you output. So now if we do mycity.printtime, you'll find that it actually clears the terminal. Here, let me just quickly build this. So we rebuild. It should clear the whole terminal when it outputs a time. Okay, so here you can see that it's cleared it, right? So now if we were to loop through this, if we do for int I equals 0, I does not equal 1,000, let's say I++, it will now kind of look like an animation because it's going to keep clearing the screen. And as it updates, you'll see the screen clear, and then it will print out this message. Okay, so let's build it. Let's just build the program here, and then output. Okay, okay, so it doesn't seem to be working too well because my seconds are increasing really quickly, and then my minutes, and it seems like it gets a little bit exponential, right? It's actually getting faster and faster and faster. So what's happening? Why is it doing this? Well, the reason is that if we look at the print time function, do you see how we change the number of seconds and minutes that have passed, right? But we never change the start time. But why don't we do that? That's the question, right? So if we don't change the start time, we keep updating our time in the class. We update the variables, but incorrectly. So what we should be doing right now is we should be going underscore start time equals get time as well. All right. So now it gets how many seconds have passed since we've last called the print time function. It then updates the seconds, minutes, and hours that have passed, and then it outputs that that time. So let's give it a go now. All right, let's build it. And okay, so it's still not updating, but why? Why is it not working? Well, the reason is that if we look at the code here, we set an integer and we statically cast these doubles. Now, what if, remember, an integer just truncates everything off after the period. So if it was 0.9 or 0.7, it would always just truncate it. So that means that in most cases, number of seconds passed would always be 0, and it would never actually update anything. So the final thing that we need to do to fix this up is that we need to make sure that number of seconds is greater than 0 before we say, okay, well, our start time must now change to wherever we are, which basically means that what we're checking for is, are we actually going to update these things when we call this print time function? If we are, then we change the values. If not, then we just run through and we print it out normally. So let's take a look at that now. All right, so we got to build it, and then we can run it. And there we go. Now you can see that the clock is running, right? So it says Johannesburg 17:38:52. All right, that's perfect. So that's working pretty well. Okay, so that's one clock, right? We've created one clock. What if we want to create another one? Let's take a look at our main code, and you can see that we've got world clock, my city. So let's create one of each of these. So the first one is just a clock, right? World clock. I'm going to call this default constructor. Okay, and what I'm going to do is just edit the code, and I'm going to remove this system clear here. Okay, I'll show why a little bit later. But okay, so we're going to create the default constructor. We're also going to create this one where we put in 3 integers. So we'll call this one 3 ints, and in that one let's make it 10 past 10 in the morning and 5 seconds. Okay, cool. So that's the 3 ints one. Let's look at this one. Here's a city name with 3 integers as well. So city 3 ints. Okay, and I'm gonna say let's say Cape Town, and I'm gonna do the same thing. So it's gonna be 17, 38, 45. And what other ones do we have? We've got one where we send in just a time string. So I'm gonna say world, and I'm gonna say unknown time string. Okay, cool. And in this case, let's make it 20, 23, 24. Okay, cool. So that's the time. Okay, so these are all of my world clocks. Now, instead of printing out just the one, I'm going to now print out all of these clocks. All right, so let's do this. All right, so these are all of our classes, the class names. And now let's just select them all and add the .print time function. Okay, cool. So that should now print out the time for each of these. And then after that, we'll do a system, or before that, let's do a system clear. So we'll do system and clear. And okay, so now it will print out all of them in one go. All right, let's build that. And let's run it. Here we go. So here's Johannesburg. So let's just pull up the, let's just put these together. So let's just take this one and put it into that desktop. Okay. So this is what I've got my output to be, right? When I print out my city, it says Johannesburg and the time. When I use a default constructor, it says it's an unknown city, and it set all of the times to 0. When I put in 3 integers, I set it to 10, 10, and 05. It said that it's an unknown city, but it's got the time right. When I put in Cape Town and 3 integers, it says Cape Town, and it starts it off, and you'll see that those should be the same because they are the same times. And then finally, when I say I've just got a time string, and I set it to 20, 23, 24, it's busy tracking those, right? There are a couple of things we can do. Firstly, we can set up that your width must always be 2 for each of these outputs, which is relatively easy to do. But you'll notice that all of these are unique, right? These instances of this class, although the class looks pretty straightforward, they all perform different things. And the fact is that I use different constructors for each of them, and that's where the importance of constructors comes in. I could use a different constructor, and it worked, and it created the class for each of them, but they were all unique. And that's really important. That's where you should see the use of a constructor. Another thing that we could do is create a copy constructor. So what that looks like is when you send in, when you say something like this, world clock ampersand copy. I'll just say copy this, right? And now what a copy constructor does is you are able to access all of the private variables within the copy this class, right? So let me explain what I mean by that. For example, if you have this, okay, let's not forget that we've got to specify where this constructor exists. So what I can do is I can say hour equals copy this dot hour, and it accesses that. You can't do that anywhere else. You can't access private variables of a class unless you're doing a copy constructor. So for example, I can do this, and let's go second equals copy this dot underscore second, start time underscore start time equals, and now we're doing a copy constructor, so we would still use the start time that the original one had, right? So that's important, the start time. But let's say now we don't want the city name to be exactly the same, right? So what we would do is we would say it's going to be the copied ones dot city name, and then plus, and let's say in brackets copy. So do you see, the copy constructor allows you to copy variables, but also specify some changes if you need to do that. If you don't need to do any changes, you don't need a copy constructor. because in most cases what your system does is it just copies all of the variables directly to a new class. So you don't always need a copy constructor, but it can be useful. So let's take a look at this one. Let's say copied, and we're gonna send in my city. So I'm copying my Johannesburg clock, and let's print out that one. So we're gonna say copied dot print time. All right, cool, and let's build it. And let's run it. Do you see how it copied the original one? The variables have been copied, but I'm able to change certain parameters, and that's where the importance of a copy constructor comes in. Okay, so this should give you a bit of an overview of how a class works. Basically, the importance behind a class being unique. That's one thing that you should really try to grasp when you work on classes, is that a lot of the time we can just use functions. We don't need a class. But in this case, because we're storing variables like names and times, and those times are constantly being updated, a class is very useful. It's quite hard to do all of this with just a function. And in main, we would have to store a lot of different variables. If we wanted to do all of these clocks, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 clocks, we would need to store 6 strings, which had the city names. And then on top of that, we would need 3 by 6, 18 different integers, which would be the hours, seconds, and minutes for each of the clocks. So we would be storing so many variables, and we'd have to do all of this variable control in main. This is where a class becomes very useful, because these things are unique. So I hope that gives a good overview. The main thing that one should be grasping when they're doing basic classes is that the class needs to be unique, and that it's an encapsulation of both functions and variables. If you have a class that just has variables, then it just needs to be a struct, right? Because the struct will have all of these variables, and you can change them all. If you made them private, then you wouldn't be able to access them, so that's a very interesting class. I don't really know what the point of that would be. But if you made them private and you had getters and setters over here, so you had functions that allow you to get the variables, what the values are, and set the variables, now it becomes a class. But is that really useful? If you just wanted to, let's say, set hour to 10, why not just make this public, right? Well, the use of the getters and setters, you can do validation. So I could say set hour, and I could say that I want to set it to 26. And what the class would do would say, okay, well, that hour variable can only be a maximum of 24. So if you want to set it to 26, we're actually going to mod it by 24 and just set it to 2. Or it will give an error and say, no, you can't do this. That's where the use of a class comes in, because now your variables are not accessible by the user. The user can't mess up your class without you knowing about it. And on top of that, you're able to implement functions that are useful, that adapt your variables and allow them to be unique. So that's just one way of looking at this, but I really would encourage you to read up about classes and see what other people think a class is and how they explain them, because obviously this explanation will work for some people but won't work for others. So I really would encourage you to do some more reading about it. Thanks very much for listening.